Hi, my name's Lucan, and I'll never forget the night they called me the waiter. At their grand family celebration, they toasted my wife's brother-in-law, the so-called perfect son-in-law, while pretending I didn't even exist. My father-in-law laughed, clapped, and said, "Now that's real class." I smiled, stayed silent, and waited. Because when the $820,000 bill landed on the table, and they tossed me my own checkbook, I finally stood up. And what I did next made every single one of them stop laughing. The first thing I noticed when Elira and I walked into her father's estate that night was the light, golden, endless, spilling across the marble floor like it belonged to someone else's world. I'd been in that house 100 times, yet somehow it still found new ways to remind me I didn't belong. The laughter came first, then the smell of steak and expensive cologne. Waiters in crisp black vests moved like a choreographed dance, refilling glasses before they were empty. I adjusted my tie and followed Elira through the grand hall, where chandeliers dangled above heads that barely turned when I passed. Her family filled every corner. Lawyers, investors, the kind of people who measure worth in brand names and square footage. Garrett Ellsworth, her father, stood at the center like a politician at his own rally, surrounded by admirers. To his right was Colin, Elira's brother-in-law, smiling that same confident smile I'd seen on magazine covers. The golden boy, as everyone called him. "Lucan, just keep calm," Elira whispered, brushing a hand over my arm before walking off to greet her mother. Her tone wasn't harsh, just tired. I stayed back near the buffet, where a few men in tailored suits talked about stocks and boats. I caught Garrett's eye for a second, long enough to give a polite nod, but he turned instead to Colin, shaking his hand firmly. "There's the pride of the family," Garrett announced, loud enough for the room to hear. "A man who knows how to carry himself." Laughter followed. I smiled faintly, mostly at the irony. A waiter brushed by me, balancing a tray of champagne flutes. Then, without looking up, someone, one of Garrett's business friends, handed me a fresh tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Here, take this around, will you?" he said, half distracted. Before I could answer, Garrett chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now that's initiative. Didn't know my son-in-law was moonlighting as help tonight." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Even the chandelier seemed to shimmer with it. I stood there, holding the tray, unsure whether to set it down or keep pretending. Alira's eyes met mine from across the room, soft, guilty, but she didn't move. Not a word, not a gesture. I swallowed the heat that climbed up my neck and did what I'd learned to do best. Smile. "Glad to be of service," I murmured, placing the tray neatly on the nearest table. They laughed harder. Someone whispered, "Guess she married down." Another voice followed. "He's polite, at least. Maybe she needed that." Every word hit like ice water, but years of family dinners had taught me restraint. I tucked my hand into my pocket and felt the square fold of my white handkerchief, a habit from my late mother. "A man's dignity," she used to say, "fits right where his pride sits." I clenched it quietly until the laughter dulled into background noise. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was hard to tell in that room where time was drowned in champagne and ego. "Garrett," one guest called, raising his glass. "Let's toast." Garrett grinned. "Of course," he said, standing tall. "To real class. To Colin." The words echoed through the marble, bouncing off every surface. Crystal clinked. Voices cheered. I stayed still. My silence, as always, said more than they'd ever understand. Elira looked away. I thought of every dinner like this one, every half-joke that cut too close, every time I told myself it wasn't worth reacting. But something shifted that night, a quiet, steady flame catching inside my chest. They thought my silence meant weakness. It didn't. It meant I was done wasting words. The catering manager approached Garrett, leaning close to his ear. I saw Garrett's eyebrows lift, then that familiar smirk tugged at his lips. "Ah, right," he said, turning toward me. "The bill's here. 820,000. He waved at the manager, then at me. "Give it to the waiter." The room chuckled again. I watched as he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out my own checkbook, the one I'd left in his study after signing last quarter's project funding, and tossed it onto the table. "You're paying, right?" he said casually, as if ordering dessert. The sound of paper against linen was louder than any insult. For a long second, no one moved. The music had stopped somewhere between cruelty and disbelief. I reached down, picked up the checkbook, and looked at it. Not him. No words, no defense, just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes people shift in their seats, unsure whether they've gone too far. I folded the check slowly, slipped it into my jacket, and nodded once. The silence was heavier than shouting. When I turned toward the door, the cold air from the hallway brushed against my face, clearing the smell of champagne from my throat. Outside, the night stretched wide and still. When I walked out into the cold that night, I wasn't leaving a party. I was leaving the last piece of my silence behind. The night hit me like truth, sharp, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. My breath rose in small clouds as I stepped down the stone steps of the Ellsworth mansion, each exhale fading into the winter air. Behind me, faint music still played, the clinking of glasses, the hum of laughter, the same laughter that had followed me for years. It spilled through the grand windows like perfume gone stale. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I crossed the circular driveway lined with luxury cars, Bentleys, Aston Martins, and one freshly waxed Rolls-Royce that seemed to mock me as I passed. Every car there was a monument to ego, parked like trophies. Mine was an old Ford, the kind that started with a prayer in cold weather. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. My hand trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of what had just happened. I looked down. The white handkerchief was still in my grip. I'd used it earlier to wipe my face, but now it just looked like a flag of surrender. For a moment, I thought about tossing it onto the snow. Instead, I folded it carefully and slipped it back into my pocket. The laughter inside grew fainter, replaced by the hush of the night. My phone buzzed in my jacket. A lira. I watched it ring once, twice, then go silent. I didn't pick up. I didn't have the words anymore. I leaned against my car and looked back at the glowing windows. It was strange how beautiful that house could seem from the outside, how easy it was to mistake cruelty for class. A cold gust brushed past, carrying me somewhere else, back to the beginning. When I first met Alira, she was radiant, free-spirited, the kind of woman who believed every problem had a polite solution. I was designing small coastal homes back then, nothing fancy, just honest work. She'd said, "My family's difficult, but they'll warm up to you." They never did. From the first dinner, her father sized me up like I was bidding for her hand in an auction. Her mother smiled thinly, asked if I'd ever been abroad, and her sister joked that I must have gotten my architecture degree online. I laughed it off. Back then, I thought tolerance was a kind of strength. "Son," my mother once told me, "people who look down on others will one day have to look up." She'd said it at our kitchen table, stirring soup with hands that had built everything I knew about dignity. I didn't understand her then. I do now. The chill started to sink through my coat. I got into the car, shutting the door, and sat in silence. The dashboard lights flickered softly, the only sound the faint hum of the engine trying to warm. I took out the check Garrett had thrown at me, my name scrawled across the top. $550,000. I'd written that check earlier that week for family expenses. Things that were supposed to be shared. Travel, donations, their endless parties. How many times had I covered for them? How many times had I mistaken humiliation for generosity? I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, older than I remembered. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, and a kind of hardness that no amount of patience could smooth away. "Maybe silence isn't grace anymore," I said quietly. "Maybe it's cowardice." The words hung in the car, raw and heavy. I started the engine and drove toward the waterfront. The streets of Charleston were almost empty, the lamps throwing long shadows across the cobblestones. Old oaks lined the sidewalks, their branches bending low like they, too, were tired of pretending to be beautiful. I parked near the pier and stepped out. The wind off the harbor cut through my coat. The water was dark, restless, whispering against the wooden posts. I leaned on the railing, letting the cold bite my skin until my hands went numb. Dignity. It doesn't vanish all at once. It erodes little by little with every insult you swallow, every laugh you pretend not to hear, every compromise you make to keep the peace. Tonight, I realized mine was almost gone. The handkerchief slipped from my pocket, caught in the wind, and drifted toward the edge of the pier. I watched it flutter, pale against the dark sky. Part of me wanted to let it go, to let it vanish like everything else they'd taken from me. But at the last second, I reached out and caught it. My fingers closed around the fabric, tight. No, not this. Not anymore. I turned back to the car, the city lights reflecting off the windshield. I unlocked my phone, scrolling through the endless family group chats. Ellsworth dinners, annual gala, weekend at Lake House. Each one a reminder of how they kept me close enough to use, but never close enough to belong. One by one, I deleted them. The little leave group notification popped up, and it felt cleaner than breathing. Then I opened my banking app, the joint account linked to Garrett's business fund. I removed my name. It took less than 30 seconds, but in that small act, I felt something shift, a silence that wasn't weakness. It was reclamation. No more funding their laughter, I whispered. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked out across the water again. The wind was sharper now, but it didn't sting as much. Maybe because, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't standing still. The house lights were miles away now, hidden behind trees and money and arrogance. Let them toast their real class. They'd forgotten one thing. The man they mocked had finally decided to stop paying for their stage. But I didn't know that night. My silence had already been replaced by something else. Their fear. By morning, the quiet of the night had turned into something else. A hum beneath the surface, like a storm gathering behind polite words. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Garrett's smirk, that check sliding across the table, the sound of laughter that still echoed somewhere inside my skull. The sun was just coming up over Charleston when I pulled into the small parking lot behind my office. The building wasn't much, 2 stories of red brick and creaky floors, but it was mine. Every corner of it had been built from years of long nights, late invoices, and stubborn belief. I unlocked the glass door, the bell chimed, and Mara looked up from the front desk. Her face was pale, eyes wide, the kind of look people get when they've been holding bad news too long. "Lucan, Garrett's office has called 3 times already," she said, voice low. "Mrs. Lang said it's urgent. Something about misuse of company funds." The words landed like cold water. "What funds?" I asked, though I already knew where this was going. She said the Ellsworth estate party, the one last night, was charged to the business account. I froze halfway across the room. "That's impossible. I paid for that out of my personal account." Mara hesitated, glancing toward the phone as if it might ring again. "They're saying the invoices came through your firm's name, that you covered it under project expenses." I leaned against the counter, the room suddenly too small. So that was their next move. Smear before I could speak. Garrett was fast. He always had a head start when it came to controlling a narrative. By noon, the whispers had already started. 2 clients called, polite but distant, both saying the same thing in different words. "Until things are clarified, we'll need to pause." Then came an email from a journalist. The subject line read, "Comment on alleged embezzlement, Charleston Herald." I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. It was incredible, really, how quickly reputation could unravel once someone powerful decided it should. One night of laughter, and suddenly I was the man who stole from his father-in-law. At around 2 o'clock, the door opened, and Alira walked in. She didn't look angry or apologetic, just cautious, as if walking into a courtroom. "Lucan," she said softly, "I came as soon as I heard." I nodded, waiting. She stood by the window, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve the way she did when nervous. "Dad says it's all a misunderstanding," she went on. "He just needs you to clarify a few things. Maybe send the receipts, explain the transfers." My jaw tightened. "Clarify? Alira, he's accusing me of using company funds. That's not confusion, it's character assassination." She looked away. "You don't know that." I stepped closer. "Did you tell him about the check? The one he threw at me?" Silence. She didn't move, didn't blink. That was all the answer I needed. "You did," I said quietly. "It's not what you think," she murmured. "He was just asking questions, and you gave him the answers." Her voice broke. "Lucan, I'm trying to keep peace here." "Peace?" I said, almost laughing. "You watched them humiliate me last night, and now you're helping them bury me this morning. You call that peace?" She didn't respond, just grabbed her coat and left, closing the door softly behind her. Like that made it hurt less. For the first time, I knew my marriage was no longer something to fix. It was something to survive. I sat down at my desk, the sketches scattered across it blurred into meaningless lines. One of them, a community project I designed for the local Veterans Fund, caught my eye. Garrett had once mocked it. "Pretty drawings for people who can't pay," he'd said. My mother's voice came back to me, raspy from her final days, yet steady. "If they ever strip your name, son, rebuild it yourself." Brick by brick, I looked around the office. The framed designs, the old coffee stains, the dent in the wall from when I'd first hung my diploma crooked. It wasn't much, but it was real. And no matter what they took, I still had the ability to create something honest, something that couldn't be forged or stolen. I opened my drawer, pulled out the folder with my personal receipts, every payment, every transfer from my own account. I spread them across the desk like pieces of armor. Then I opened a new file on my computer labeled Ellsworth Documentation. Emails, invoices, screenshots. I documented everything, quietly, methodically. By sunset, my lawyer friend Eamon called. "Heard something's brewing," he said. "You need help?" "Not yet," I said. "Just be ready when I call." He paused. "You going after them?" I looked out the window. The city lights flickered against the horizon, the same skyline that had once felt like promise. "No," I said finally. "I'm just letting them dig. We'll let them bury themselves." Eamon chuckled softly. "That's the Lucan I remember." "Not quite," I replied. The old me stayed quiet. This one's taking notes. When the call ended, I sat there a long time, the hum of the heater filling the silence. The anger that had burned since last night had cooled into something sharper. Control. I gathered the receipts into a neat pile, clipped them, and placed them inside my briefcase. Outside, Charleston was winding down, the same calm before another storm, and I knew exactly where it would begin. That night, as the city lights dimmed, I realized the real battle wouldn't be fought in court. It would start at their next celebration. The week passed in a haze of headlines and half-truths. My name floated through Charleston's business circles like smoke, never seen but always smelled. By Friday morning, the rumors had settled into something quieter, more dangerous: silence. That was Garrett's favorite weapon. When the noise stopped, it meant the trap was ready. Late that afternoon, a gold-embossed envelope arrived at my office. The seal bore Garrett's initials, two interlocking G's polished like pride. Inside, the invitation read, "A night of gratitude, celebrating family and partnership." Gratitude. The word alone could have made me laugh if it didn't sting so much. Eamon looked at it across my desk. "You know this isn't about gratitude," he said. "It's theater." "I know," I replied. He leaned back in his chair. "Then go. If they want an audience, give them one. Just not the show they expect." By the time the sun went down, I had already decided. The estate was 30 miles outside the city, spread across acres of land that smelled faintly of pine and power. The last time I'd walked through those gates, I'd left humiliated. Tonight, I walked in the same black suit, but my posture carried something different. The driveway was lined with cars worth more than most homes in Charleston. A valet reached for my keys, hesitated as if wondering if my Ford belonged among them. I handed them over anyway, smiling. She runs better than she looks. Inside, the mansion glowed brighter than before. Chandeliers reflected off crystal glasses, and music poured through the hall like confidence. Garrett stood near the grand staircase, holding court again. When he spotted me, his grin widened. "Well, if it isn't our favorite waiter," he said, loud enough for every ear to turn. Laughter followed like a reflex. I smiled back, calm and unhurried. "Glad to serve excellence again," I said evenly. The laughter faltered for just a second. Garrett's smirk stiffened, unsure if he'd just been insulted. The pause tasted sweet. I took a glass from a passing tray and moved toward the back of the room. The air was thick with perfume, champagne, and pretense. Faces turned toward me with polite curiosity, whispering the kind of phrases people use when they pretend to care. Then I saw Elira. She looked beautiful in the way distance makes someone look untouchable, her silver dress catching the light, her expression tight. She pulled me aside quickly. "Why are you here?" she hissed under her breath. I met her eyes. "Because you invited me." Her hand tightened around my sleeve. "Lucan, please don't make a scene." "Don't worry," I said softly. "That's not my part tonight." Her gaze flicked toward Colin across the room, the golden son-in-law laughing too loud, gesturing too big. He caught my eye and raised his glass in mock salute. I almost smiled. Almost. Dinner was announced soon after. Long tables draped in white silk, silver cutlery shining beneath soft light. I took my seat near the end, right where Garrett wanted me. The speeches began, each one thicker with self-praise than the last. Halfway through dessert, Garrett stood tapping his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that false humility of practiced charm. "Tonight we celebrate not just success, but loyalty." He paused, letting the word hang. Family loyalty and responsibility. His eyes found me across the table. "Because some of us," he continued, "still need to learn that loyalty means respecting hierarchy." A few polite chuckles drifted through the crowd. I didn't move, didn't blink, just watched him, letting the silence expand between us until even the laughter felt awkward. He looked away first. As the room returned to conversation, I noticed something odd. Colin, his chosen prodigy, was checking his phone again and again, frowning each time. His knee bounced under the table. Garrett leaned toward him once, whispered something, and Colin's smile tightened like glass about to crack. A fracture, small but visible. I finished my wine slowly. As Garrett launched into another monologue about his latest investment venture, I listened carefully. The project name caught my attention. Hawthorne Landing. My pulse steadied. I knew that property. I had designed it 5 years ago, long before Garrett ever touched it. And unless he'd rewritten history, I still owned 40% of the design rights. He didn't know that. The irony almost made me laugh. I reached for my phone under the table, opened my messages, and typed, "Pull the Hawthorne contract, tonight." Eamon replied within seconds. "On it," quietly. Garrett kept talking, basking in applause, raising his glass like a king to his loyal court. But I was no longer listening. The walls that had once trapped me now felt like the edge of a chessboard, and for the first time, I could see every move. When Garrett raised his glass again, I already knew his empire was built on my signature, and I was about to take it back. By the time I left the estate, the air outside had cooled to a damp midnight chill. The party lights faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the steady glow of Charleston's skyline ahead. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was already racing through blueprints, contracts, signatures. Garrett's toast still echoed in my ears, hollow, arrogant, blind. Eamon's office sat above a closed coffee shop downtown. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that made every step sound like a decision. I pushed open the glass door, and the familiar scent of old paper and black coffee greeted me. Inside, the only light came from a single desk lamp, a warm circle in a sea of shadows. Eamon was already there, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on the glow of his laptop. Piles of documents surrounded him like fortifications. He looked up when I entered. "You didn't even stop for a drink, did you?" he asked, smirking faintly. "Didn't feel like celebrating," I replied. He gestured to the chair beside him. "Then let's give Garrett something to drink about." I sat, unbuttoned my jacket, and watched as he navigated through folders, company registries, and digital archives. His fingers moved fast. A man who'd spent too many nights like this, hunting for truth in a forest of legal jargon. "There," he muttered after a few minutes, tapping the screen. "Seaside Expansion Project. Owned under Ellsworth Development Holdings. But look at this." He scrolled to the attachments, opening a scanned deed. The edges of the document flickered on screen like a ghost resurrected from the past. My eyes caught it instantly. The signature at the bottom, mine, next to the printed words, Lucan R. Hale, 40% design and ownership. I exhaled slowly. "He didn't just steal the idea," I said quietly. "He used my work, my plans, my name, everything." Eamon leaned back. "He built his empire on your foundation." The words felt heavier than the room itself. For a moment, I just stared at that digital page. Every line of the blueprint, every measurement, every material choice, it was my handwriting, my creation. Garrett had laughed at that design once, called it too sentimental for profit. And yet, here it was, the backbone of his multi-million-dollar expansion. Zoom in, I said. Eamon frowned but obeyed. The fine print at the bottom came into focus, a clause buried beneath signatures and seals. Any modification, reproduction, or financial gain derived from this design requires written consent from the owner. Eamon's eyes widened. Lucan, he never filed one. I felt something inside me click into place. That's it, the missing clause. He looked at me. This gives you control. It's not just breach of contract, it's copyright infringement. He can't sell, expand, or even advertise without your consent. I leaned forward, my voice steady. He thought I was too quiet to read my own work. Eamon chuckled under his breath. That's what happens when arrogance meets patience. I rubbed my temples, staring at the document again. My reflection glimmered faintly on the laptop screen. Older, calmer, not the man who'd walked out of Garrett's house a week ago, humiliated. Every insult, every patronizing smile, every whisper behind my back, all of it played like a film reel. And yet, the cruelest irony was this. The very arrogance that led them to mock me had also made them careless. They used my silence as proof of weakness, I murmured. But silence was the only thing that kept me listening. Eamon started typing, drafting a formal notice of copyright infringement. This will take him down hard, he said. You want me to send it tonight? I shook my head. No. Let him sleep easy for a few more days. Eamon raised an eyebrow. You planning something? I'm going to let him announce his record-breaking profits first, I said, in front of everyone. The investors, the family, the city board, all the people who think he's untouchable. Eamon smiled, the kind of smile lawyers save for rare moments of satisfaction. You've got a mean streak under all that calm, Hale. Not mean, I corrected softly. Measured. The clock on the wall ticked past 1:30. The city outside was quiet, rain beginning to fall in fine streaks against the windows. Eamon slid the printed draft toward me. I picked up the pen, reading the notice one last time. Every word felt deliberate, precise, a mirror to the man I was becoming again. As I signed, something white on the corner of the desk caught my eye. A folded handkerchief, slightly crumpled. Mine. I'd left it there during our last meeting, the night Garrett's secretary had called to accuse me of fraud. I picked it up, smoothed it out, and tucked it into my breast pocket. Eamon looked up. Sentimental, huh? Symbolic, I said, standing. They've made enough messes. Let's make them clean this one up. He nodded. You really think Garrett will see it coming? I smiled faintly. He's too busy looking down to notice who's standing back up. As I turned toward the door, the rain had grown heavier, the kind that washes away everything shallow. Laughter, gossip, pretense. 3 days later, the Ellsworth boardroom would be packed, and Garrett was about to thank me in public. 3 days later, I stood outside the glass doors of Ellsworth Corporation, watching my reflection ripple across the polished surface. My tie was straight, my hands steady, but beneath the calm exterior, my pulse carried the rhythm of something final. Garrett had chosen this morning to announce his legacy project, and he wanted me there, to witness his triumph. The receptionist's smile froze the moment she saw me. Mr. Hale, I didn't know you were... I'm expected, I said simply. Inside, the grand boardroom stretched like a cathedral of power. Long mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Charleston's skyline, and rows of well-dressed men and women whispering over their tablets. At the head of it all stood Garrett, surrounded by his investors, his daughter Elira, and of course Colin, the golden husband who had mastered the art of standing one step behind power. When Garrett spotted me, he grinned wide, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ah, there he is. I was afraid you'd be too embarrassed after the last party. I smiled back, measured and calm. Wouldn't miss it for the world. He laughed, and the others followed like trained echoes. I took a seat near the corner, placing a slim leather folder before me. No one noticed that I didn't open it. The meeting began with the usual pomp, numbers, slides, applause, words like growth and vision tossed around like confetti. Garrett moved with the confidence of a man who believed his empire was untouchable. Our new seaside expansion, he said, raising his voice just enough to echo across the room, will redefine this state's coast. Jobs, innovation, sustainability. It's the future of Ellsworth. He paused, looking straight at me. And we owe it all to family loyalty. A few polite chuckles rippled through the room. Alira looked down. Colin smirked. I kept my eyes on Garrett and said nothing. When the applause began to fade, I rose slowly from my chair. May I? The room went quiet. Garrett, amused, gestured with a flourish. By all means, Lucan. Entertain us. I picked up the folder and walked to the front of the table. My shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, the sound crisp in the silence. I laid a single blueprint across the table, aged paper, the edges slightly yellowed, marked with my handwriting. This design you're celebrating, I said evenly, it was mine. Signed and registered 5 years ago. A few people leaned forward. One of the board members adjusted his glasses. Garrett blinked, then laughed, a loud, uncomfortable sound. Ridiculous. You can't possibly prove it. I slid 2 documents across the table, the deed and the federal copyright certificate. My name gleamed in bold ink. Already did. The silence that followed was almost physical. You could hear the hum of the projector still running, displaying his stolen project on the screen behind him. Alira's hand rose to her mouth. Colin's smirk vanished, replaced by the colorless stare of a man calculating consequences. Garrett's eyes darted between the pages, then to me, then to the room, realizing too late that every whisper he heard now carried the same word: fraud. He straightened, voice cracking just slightly. This is absurd. You can't just walk in here with... The doors opened. Eamon stepped in, briefcase in hand, his expression calm but sharp. Actually, he said, setting a document on the table, he can... As of this morning, Ellsworth Corporation is in breach of federal design law and subject to immediate injunction. A murmur swept through the room. Eamon looked around. Which means any ongoing contracts tied to the seaside expansion are now frozen until the matter is resolved in court. Garrett's smirk collapsed entirely. You... I cut him off, my voice quiet but firm. You built your empire on my signature. You forgot to erase the name. The board members started whispering, glancing between us. Someone reached for their phone. Another quietly closed their laptop. The illusion of power cracked right there on that polished floor. Garrett tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his throat. I opened my jacket, reached into the breast pocket, and drew out the white handkerchief I'd folded days earlier. I laid it gently on the table, in front of him. You mocked me for cleaning your mess. Now clean this. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence carried weight. Years of humiliation, of laughter at my expense, dissolving in a single act of composure. I gathered my folder, nodded once to Eamon, and turned toward the doors. As I walked out, I didn't look back. The sound of voices rose behind me, panic, denial, damage control, but none of it mattered anymore. Out in the hallway, the glass walls shimmered with morning light. For the first time in years, the reflection looking back at me didn't feel like a shadow. But as I reached the elevators, my phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. You think it's over? He's not done yet. And I exhaled slowly. Garrett still had one more card to play. By the time I pulled into my driveway, night had swallowed the neighborhood. Rain had started again. Thin, cold, relentless, tapping against the porch roof like a warning I didn't want to hear. Inside, my home office glowed dimly in the corner of the living room, papers and sketches still spread out from the last few days. The silence felt earned. For the first time in years, I could breathe without bracing for someone's mockery. Then headlights cut through the rain. A car stopped in front of the gate. The driver stepped out, hood up, carrying a thick envelope sealed in black. No words, no eye contact, just a handoff. When the car pulled away, I tore the seal open. Legal documents spilled across the table. My name appeared again and again, but this time as the accused, plaintiff, Garrett Ellsworth, defendant, Lucan R. Hale, charges, corporate theft, defamation, and breach of fiduciary duty. My stomach sank, but my hands stayed steady. Each page reeked of manipulation. Forged signatures, fake timestamps, even an email trail claiming I'd stolen design files from the company years ago. The audacity almost made me laugh. He's framing me, I muttered, the words tasting bitter. I flipped through every sheet until the rain outside sounded like static. Garrett's game was clear now. If he couldn't erase me quietly, he'd bury me publicly. My phone buzzed, then again, and again. What happened? Lucan, tell me this isn't true. They're saying you stole from your own family. I opened one message with a link, a local business column. The headline hit like a hammer. Architect accused of betrayal. Family empire torn apart by theft allegations. Garrett's PR team had moved fast. Within an hour, they'd painted me as a bitter ex-partner turned saboteur. The same people who had congratulated me at the boardroom now reposted statements condemning me for betrayal. For a moment, I sat there in the dark, letting the weight of it all press down. The humiliation, the headlines, the echo of laughter from his parties. It all came back like a wave ready to crush, but I didn't drown in it this time. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled, and whispered, if he wants war, he'll get silence first. The rain kept falling. Minutes passed, then headlights again. Smaller this time, slower. I stood as the doorbell rang. Alira. She stood there drenched, her mascara running, her eyes red. You have to stop this, she said, voice trembling. Dad's furious. He'll ruin you, Lucan. He's already... I cut her off gently. He already did. Now I'm just cleaning up the evidence. She stepped inside, clutching her coat like it could hold her together. You don't understand. He's been planning this for years. Those documents, the emails, they're fake, yes, but he planted them in the archives long ago. He knew one day you might come back. So he forged history, I said quietly. She nodded. He thinks you'll panic, fight back too soon. That's when he'll crush you. I turned toward my desk where the flash drive lay beside a stack of old designs. He forgot something, I said. The original drafts were backed up on a drive registered to my name. Every file time-stamped, every edit traceable. Her lips parted, a flicker of realization dawning. You can destroy him with that. I don't need to destroy him, I said, looking at her. He's already doing that himself. Lucan, please, she whispered. He's still my father. I studied her for a long moment. The woman I once loved had become a reflection of two worlds, torn between blood and truth. You asked me to be invisible, I said softly. Now watch what that costs. She said nothing more. When she left, the rain had softened to mist. Her car disappeared down the street, taillights fading into red ghosts. By dawn, I was back at Eamon's office. The city was waking, coffee shops opening, headlines shifting. Eamon looked up from his computer as I entered, holding a USB drive between my fingers. Ready? He asked. More than ever. We spent the next hour drafting 2 moves, a counter lawsuit complete with time-stamped proof and a formal briefing to the state's Architecture Association. Garrett had lied to them for years, using my designs as his own. Now they'd be the ones to speak. No interviews, I told Eamon. No press from me. Let the facts do the talking. He smiled faintly. Your silence again? It's the only language they never learned to understand. By the time I stepped outside, the morning sun was breaking through the clouds. I watched it rise over the skyline, the same city that once mocked me now about to see the truth. By the next morning, Garrett's empire was trending on every news feed, and the world finally saw who the real thief was. By the next morning, the storm had shifted, not in the clouds, but across every screen in the country. The light coming through my kitchen window felt different that day, warmer, calmer, the kind of light that only comes after chaos has done its job. My coffee sat untouched as the TV flickered with the headline that had already gone viral. The Silent Architect Scandal. Ellsworth Empire under investigation. The anchor's voice was steady, but the footage behind her wasn't. They were broadcasting side-by-side images, Garrett shaking hands with state officials, cutting ribbons, smiling for cameras, then overlays of blueprints stamped with my name. The association had released everything, my original drafts, time-stamped files, and the official statement naming me as the rightful designer of the seaside expansion. The anchor said, every major project credited to Garrett Ellsworth in the past decade traces back to one man, architect Lucan Hale. The evidence is overwhelming. They called me the silent architect. I didn't know whether to laugh or sigh. Then they showed Garrett, storming out of his mansion, yelling at reporters, face pale and twisted with disbelief. Cameras flashed like lightning around him. My phone buzzed again. Alira. When I answered, her voice cracked through the static. He's losing it. He's tearing the house apart, screaming your name. You need to stop this before He's just cleaning up what he built, I said quietly, and hung up. By noon, footage rolled of Garrett shoving through a sea of microphones at the corporate building, shouting that it was all lies, that I had framed him. The board had already called an emergency meeting, this time without him. I parked across the street and watched the chaos unfold. News vans lined the block, reporters shouting over one another. Garrett burst through the glass doors, barking at the guards. The man who once walked like royalty now moved like prey, cornered in his own castle. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with nervous tension. I walked in unnoticed at first, slipping into the back. Garrett was already mid-rant. "You think you can freeze my accounts?" he shouted at a lawyer. "I am this company." Colin sat at the far end, his once perfect smile replaced by sweat and silence. His tie was crooked. His hand trembled as he scrolled through headlines on his phone. When Garrett finally saw me, his voice broke into a snarl. "You think this makes you a man, Lucan? You destroyed your family." I met his eyes. "No, I just stopped pretending we were one." The room fell silent. Even the air conditioner seemed to hold its breath. Then the door opened, and two officials in dark suits entered, followed by Eamon. The sound of their footsteps was deliberate, final. One of them set a folder on the table. "Mr. Ellsworth," he said, "your accounts have been frozen pending federal review. We'll need your cooperation to proceed." Garrett's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Around the table, the same investors who had laughed at me weeks ago now leaned forward, their voices suddenly syrup-sweet. "Lucan," one said, "perhaps you could stay on, help stabilize the company. You know the designs better than anyone." I shook my head. "I'm not here to rebuild what was never mine to begin with." Colin looked up then, eyes glassy, desperate. He tried to speak, but Garrett's glare shut him down. The great patriarch, once untouchable, now looked like a man watching his own kingdom sink beneath his feet. I took one last step toward him, pulled the folded white handkerchief from my jacket, and placed it on the polished table between us. "You called me the waiter," I said softly. "Now consider this the tip." For a second, no one breathed. Garrett stared at the small square of fabric as if it were a mirror showing him everything he'd refused to see. I turned and walked out, my footsteps steady against the marble floor. Outside, the air felt light, sharp with sunlight and the faint scent of salt drifting from the coast. I stood there for a moment, letting it wash over me. The noise behind those glass walls faded until it became nothing but a hum. Weeks passed before I saw that building again. I drove along the coastal highway one late afternoon, past the site where the seaside expansion had once stood as a monument to greed. Now it was silent, construction halted, cranes frozen mid-air like forgotten giants. I pulled over, stepping out into the wind. The ocean stretched endless and gray, the sound of waves mingling with the rustle of tarp and steel. In my hand, I held the final blueprint, unsigned, unclaimed. "Finally quiet," I whispered. The breeze caught the paper, lifting it gently from my fingers. It spiraled upward once, twice, before drifting out toward the sea. One design, one dream, finally free. I turned back toward my car, ready to leave it all behind. Then my phone rang. The name on the screen froze me where I stood. Alira. Her voice trembled when I answered. "Lucan, it's not about my father this time." For a moment I couldn't speak. The quiet on the line felt heavier than words. 2 weeks had passed since the collapse, since every screen in America carried Garrett's downfall. I thought that chapter of my life was sealed, but her voice pulled me right back into the echo of it. "I'm at the estate," she said finally. "You should come. There's something you need to see." The drive out to the Ellsworth mansion felt surreal. The once grand gates hung half open, rust biting at the hinges. The garden that used to host summer galas was overgrown and silent. I parked under the dead oak tree, the same one that had framed our wedding photos years ago, and walked up the cracked driveway. Inside, the air was still. Dust clung to every surface, and the faint scent of old whiskey and paper lingered. Alira stood in the hallway, her eyes red, a folder clutched against her chest. "He's gone," she said quietly. "No one knows where. The staff found his car at the beach 2 days ago, but nothing else." She led me into Garrett's old office, then in the same room where he'd once signed contracts and barked orders like a king. Now the curtains were drawn, the desk bare. Only one thing remained, the large portrait of himself that had hung behind the desk. He had a safe behind it, she said. You installed it years ago. I remembered. Back then he'd said, every man should have a place for the truth. Alira pushed the portrait aside, revealing the small steel door. She handed me a slip of paper with the code, my code. Inside the safe lay a single envelope, aged and yellowed, the corners curled. On the front, written in the heavy, deliberate handwriting I knew too well, for Lucan. My throat tightened as I opened it. The letter inside was long, the words uneven, some letters faded as if written through shaking hands. Lucan, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't waste time looking for me. I don't deserve to be found. You were right. The designs were yours. I knew it from the start. I just couldn't stand that everyone admired the quiet one. You had what I never did. Respect without noise. I spent my life mistaking fear for authority, applause for love. When I mocked you, when I tried to humiliate you, I wasn't proving your weakness. I was proving mine. Every time you stayed silent, it made me smaller. The night of the party, I didn't do it to celebrate. I did it to crush you, to remind myself I was still the center of this world. But when you tore that check in half, when you walked out without a word, I saw myself disappear in your silence. I don't expect forgiveness. But if there's anything left of the man you once called family, remember this. The empire wasn't the inheritance. You were. The letter ended there. No signature. No closing line. Just a smudge of ink, like the pen had slipped from his hand. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The rain started outside, tapping against the window the way it always did before one of his rages. But this time, it was gentle, like a whisper. Alira sat on the arm of the old chair, tears sliding down her cheeks. He left that for you, not even for me. I folded the letter carefully. Maybe that was the only honest thing he ever gave. 2 days later, she called again, this time from the old family beach house, the place where his company had first been built. The shoreline was quiet when I arrived, waves brushing against the stilts under the deck. The house looked smaller now, stripped of its grandeur. Alira stood near the porch, holding something white in her hands. When she turned, I saw what it was, the same handkerchief I'd left on Garrett's desk. He kept it, she said softly. All these years. I found it folded inside the drawer with your first blueprint. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The irony stung. The same cloth he'd once mocked had become the one thing he couldn't throw away. Then maybe, I said quietly, he wasn't all wrong. We stood there watching the tide roll in. The horizon was gray but calm, the kind of calm that doesn't erase pain, just softens it. Later that evening, back home, I pulled out one of the old blueprints from my office drawer. In the lower corner, 2 signatures overlapped, his initials beside mine. I cut out that square, framed it, and hung it above my desk. Below it, I wrote, silence is not weakness, it's memory. As the sun dipped below the window, I turned off the lights, leaving the room in a soft amber glow. The house felt still, but not empty, just quiet. Garrett had taken everything loud, the noise, the pride, the spotlight. I took back everything quiet.